Good evening from our headquarters in Kiev. This is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Natalia Humaniuk.
Massive ransomware attack hits Ukraine. We try to find out what's behind this cyber attack. 4 years of drama in one outgoing interview with the head of the IMF in Ukraine. Who is the Russian soldier recently captured in eastern Ukraine? Macron's foreign policy. What should Ukraine and Europe expect from the French leader? And how to restore trust in government institutions.
Go to our webpage en.hromadske.ua, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, search Hromadske International on the web. We will be back in a second. Ukraine experienced the biggest hacker attack in its history. A ransomware virus has attacked almost 100 Ukrainian companies, banks and government institutions. The Khatia virus blocked computers by exploiting weaknesses in the operating system, and it was later revealed that it encoded the data, which now might be lost. We at Hromadske are still counting the damage, as there is no single figure for this yet. And there is always concern this could be either exaggerated or covered up. Cybercrime is still a mystery for many people, including those in the business and the government, so the attack has created a lot of guessing and speculations. Since Ukraine is openly at war with Russia, it also raises many questions. Some of the trusted digital security experts would say that analysis of the malware used for the massive cyber attack against Ukraine is evidence of a new cyber weapon. However, we are here to provide you with either verified information or explanations from trusted analysts. As they say, it's way too early to say who was behind the attack. We talked to Vadym Losev, a digital security expert who works with many companies in Eastern Europe.
Apparently on the 27th of June, there was a malicious update to a piece of software which is popular in Ukraine and which is called MEDOC. It has something to do with financial reporting, I guess. So anyway, a lot of people got an update for that piece of software, which happened to be a piece of malware, and which spread across networks and encrypted information on a bunch of computers. And when I say bunch, I mean thousands of tens of thousands. This is huge. I don't know how much money people and companies have lost. It will probably take some time to count the damage.
How long would it might take, and what were the cases and precedents where, the attribution had been?
It usually takes weeks to months. It really depends on the political interest of a particular government. But it usually takes, I would say, weeks or a month or maybe several months. But so far, they've only come to some basic factual conclusions, like how does the malware actually spread, or what kind of systems it actually infects, but not the attribution part.
What was new for you?
For me, what was actually, like the attack itself on a technical level is nothing new technologically. However, every attack like that has a bigger and bigger scale in terms of impact on economy and on life. What was new for me is we're already in a place where a computer problem can stop commerce or travel or interfere with governments, which was not the case 10 years ago.
Is there any special about Ukraine being so unsecure, so kind of not prepared for that? Or what would be your experience?
There's actually nothing special about Ukraine as a country. It was a clever attack. It spread through a method that mostly worked in Ukraine, and so Ukraine suffered the most. If a different method was used, I would guess almost any other country in this region would probably not do much better.
Another method about this kind of the way how genius could be the hackers from the post-Soviet space. Like all the political discussion is about Russian hacks, about people coming from this region. If we don't speak particularly about this attack, is it the case? Do we really, seen that there is something special taking place in the post-Soviet world?
The post-Soviet region, the former Soviet Union, has a lot of really intelligent people, and those people are often paid very little, and so there is incentive for them to look for alternative ways of making money. I am not really convinced that ex-Soviet hackers are any better than German, Romanian, British, American, Chinese, or any other kind of hackers. However, people keep telling themselves and other people that story. This is human nature. But it is true that there is a huge hacker underground, including an extensive criminal underground in this region, including Ukraine. But that has to do with low living standards and the ability to do bad stuff and go unpunished, because the legal system may not work very well in a particular case involving computer crime.
Finally, and then can we speak about the specific of the hackers' cooperation with the security services, with intelligence?
IT people, like people representing other professions, routinely work with intelligence services. Sometimes the way it works, the way IT blogs and books describe that, somebody would do something wrong, and then he's approached by either law enforcement or intelligence, and then made an offer which he or she cannot refuse. But this is not specific to an ex-Soviet region. Reportedly, it works like that everywhere. The government is looking for talented IT people. Talented IT people usually want a lot of money, which the government cannot afford to pay them. So unless there's a hook, unless something wrong and then they have to cooperate, I would say that governments everywhere are desperately looking for talent.
Is there any specific of the hackers' cooperation in the dictatorship?
A lot of countries which are not usually associated with democracy, think some countries in Central Asia, still can buy hacking technology and equipment in the open market, because there is an open and legal market, and use it against their citizens, or against the enemies, or against this has become a commercial market. It's a part of modern capitalism, like hacking and surveillance technology and censorship and censorship technology is as much a part of modern capitalism as banking or industry or insurance.
The International Monetary Fund is a huge player in Ukraine's reforms. In April 2014, the IMF approved a program with a credit line totaling $17.5 billion to help steer Ukraine back onto a sustainable path. Up till now, over half of the funds have been received. The government, on its part, took tough measures to stabilize the economy, but progress in structural reforms has been mixed. The key issues were macroeconomic stabilization, stopping inflation, and reforming the National Bank of Ukraine, including the nationalization of one of the biggest banks. Jerome Vacher has been running the IMF resident representative office here in Kiev for 4 years and is about to leave this position this month. Watch his outgoing interview with Hromadske. You've been here for 4 years, a very dramatic time, and I'd like to give the general overview. Was really Ukraine at some point, when we are speaking about it, dealing with IMF, on the edge of default, on the edge of bankruptcy? Now it's just kind of a steady cooperation. So can you just very generally say what was the state of affairs what risk were, and at what conditions are we now?
And it was not a sustainable situation. You had a very large current account deficit, a large fiscal deficit, no growth, reserves which were being exhausted, and an unsustainable exchange rate. So that was the starting point. But of course, with all the shocks that Ukraine has been going through, it has made the situation extremely difficult. I remember vividly from some of the first meetings I had in February 24th of 2014, for example. So these moments were pretty decisive, and I think the international community reacted very, very quickly at the time. With, of course, a lot of commitment from the authorities at the time to show that they were ready to take reforms, and that was something which we forget now, but which was very important for the international community, because the experience previously with Ukraine had been of a lack of commitment to undertake reforms, and a number of failed attempts.
So Ukraine over this time had received almost $9 billion of the US dollars. We had the loans, we had the restructurization of the national debt. That looks good so far, but we know that there are that Ukraine has to give the loans back. So, and especially there would be 2018, 2019. So really, would Ukraine be able to really give those money back, or that we would have another talk about restructurization of the debt and also again postponing? So that would be still the loan which you have rather than solution.
I think when we put in place an IMF program and IMF support, which we reassess periodically for each review, every time we look at of course at the capacity of the country to repay. We do not want to overburden the country. That debt restructuring has allowed to gain some breathing space for some time. But indeed, that means also that the repayments will start to increase after some point. All this, in fact, should be, I think, an additional motivation for the authorities to understand that they need to continue to accumulate reserves. Ukraine at the moment is still not attracting enough foreign direct investment.
Is it really happening?
I think we have seen a lot of changes, but as we have underlined on a few occasions, and I would certainly leave this as a message, there is really a need to accelerate reforms and what we call structural reforms, which in the case of Ukraine are very focused on the need to improve the business environment, to improve the situation with respect to corruption. That takes many forms, including, for example, reforming the state-owned enterprises, which it's not only a fiscal issue, but it's also an issue of governance.
Is Ukraine still an oligarchy?
It is still a system where you have a number of large groups which are involved in different sectors of the economy, where vested interests are very powerful in the political system. At the same time, we do not see a large role for small and medium-sized enterprises, and that is one of the things that will need to change going forward, and in particular to make growth much more sustainable. It's a pity because we see a lot of potential in Ukraine, and these are also industries which are less regulated or less prone to vested interests. Looking at the role of state-owned enterprises, because very often there is a large influence of vested interest in those enterprises.
So what is your personal encounter, maybe a personal communication during this week with these people like Rinat Akhmetov or Igor Kolomoisky, whom you can't ignore if you speak about the Ukrainian reform?
We, as an institution, we are not dealing with individuals or individual companies specifically. So I do not. My main task is to discuss with the authorities and to discuss the policies. But that's the way I approach it. I do not. We do not assign a more important role to different people, and we do not deal specifically with individual institutions. So we do not see that there are some individuals which should be treated above the law. The law should apply to everybody, and a good part of the policy that we support is also to end some of the impunity that we have seen for way too long in Ukraine. But it's also important to see that there are a number of policies where actually which are not labeled as anti-corruption, but which have an important impact. In particular, as maybe you alluded to, for example, in the financial sector, where a lot of the effort has been made by the central bank to ask when there are vulnerabilities which are detected, to ask the bank owners to put capital in the bank. Similarly, there was a big effort done to address issues of what we call related party lending, meaning that a lot of the banks were actually used by their owners to finance their own activities in breach of Ukrainian prudential regulation, but any kind of international best practice. And it's no surprise that we see also very often some resistance from vested interest, and in particular through the political system to those policies.
So Valeria, if we started to speak about the National Bank, of course, Valeria Gontareva has resigned. There should be still her resignation had to be admitted. But if we're already speaking about a new person, what kind of tasks you are expecting from the new head of the National Bank? What would be that he or she must have to do?
I think it's important to see first that Mrs. Gontareva, as governor of the National Bank of Ukraine during those years, has done a tremendous job in doing what has not been done for way too many years, meaning properly supervising and cleaning up the banking sector, but also reforming the central bank as an institution. It is now a modern central bank with which we can have an informed dialogue. It is really a revamped and new central bank. So there will be an important effort together with the government and the Ministry of Finance to have a proper strategy for state-owned banks, for ensuring a proper governance of state-owned banks. The other one is, of course, the fact that there are a lot of vested interests. There are a lot of bank owners, including in Parliament, which, of course, we're not happy with some of the policies which were, in fact, rightly put in place.
So, can you tell the story of the nationalization of the private bank? As this is a really important issue of the last year, what was the role of the IMF and international community?
First of all, the story is not over because in many ways it is an ongoing process, and we shouldn't forget that. It took several years. First of all, to understand the extent of the problem. Like for many other banks also, which were weak and improperly managed in the system, That was the first step, and which was not an easy step. Now there are a lot of challenges still ahead with the nationalization of that bank. Meaning in particular that there is still a strong need to make the utmost effort to recover as much as feasible from the loans which were not paid. Most of them, as you know, were granted to related parties, basically shareholders and related parties. So that is the main task at the moment. The task of stabilizing the liability side, which is basically the deposit side, has been achieved.
How much is that burden for the Ukrainian economy?
Well, we'll have to assess what will be the final cost. The recoveries in those cases take some time. For the time being, as you know, the cost is in excess of 5% of GDP, but we hope that as much effort will be done to lower that amount.
But were you really, I mean, overall general, if we're speaking about that, it was never smooth cooperation. It's not always that smooth. So where are the things which are really annoying for you and which had annoyed you during this time?
I think a lot more needs to be done on the anti-corruption front, and if I would like to see much quicker progress, and I think we could have achieved quicker progress is on that front. And again, it covers a number of areas, including on things like state-owned enterprises, privatization, for example, where the progress has been very, very slow.
We investigated a lot of things, but when you speak about fighting corruption in Ukraine, what do you mean in particular?
The only way to address that is to make sure that the Ukrainian authorities also address this issue of impunity, and for that, now I think we have a better detection, investigation of some of the high-level corruption in particular. But what is missing is basically the last step, which is also perhaps one of the most important, which is at the judicial level. And we still see a very significant gap. For example, there's been a lot of progress done with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, but what we see is that a lot of the cases basically die in court. So one of the options that has been supported by the international community together with civil society is, for example, the creation of an anti-corruption court, which would seek to address that big gap that we see. It is true in other areas as well. I mean, we have talked about the efforts of the National Bank to clean up the banking system, and what we see, unfortunately, is that some of these cases where the former owner should be sanctioned actually also dying in court because there are a lot of issues with the court system still. We are now in a stage where some of the structural reforms need to be accelerated and deepened. And in many countries, it's actually one of the most difficult stages, because from some of these reforms are particularly difficult to implement. They're difficult to design, first of all, then to implement.
We are speaking about the next tranche from next loan. As some of the investors says that there are issues with that. So what are the conditions to be fulfilled in order to get it? What is the probability of not getting it? And when we can expect that?
We need to have clarity on a number of issues, and of course the usual issues that are included in the IMF program and in all areas, including financial sector, fiscal, energy, and so on. But this time around, there is a number of policies where there is a bit more focus, and we discussed some of them, but that includes, for example, pension reform, anti-corruption policies, including the creation of an anti-corruption court, land reform and privatization. It takes as much time as is needed to find what we call first a staff level agreement on the policies, and that we can move forward to a discussion with at the board level.
What would be your main, or for instance, if we would say about single advice to your predecessor, to the person who come to do what you've been doing? What would be this thing he or she needs to know?
I think it's in that work, and I think especially in Ukraine, I think it's important to be firm, but meaning to be firm on our principles and our policies, and especially on the structural changes that are needed to achieve sustainable growth in this country. I don't think it helps Ukraine if we are softening our principle or changing our principles, or we need to find the best policies, and we need to provide our firm and consistent advice.
A low-intensity military conflict. That's how we could describe the current stage of Russian-Ukrainian war in eastern Donbass. There is a lot of evidence of Russian support for the separatists. We have data about Russian soldiers fighting in the east, yet there is the idea that when there is no active fighting, Moscow would rather prefer to coordinate the separatists than send its own military. Though this week, a Russian soldier, Viktor Ageyev, who was a member of the 4th separate motorized brigade of the People's Militia of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, had been detained by the Ukrainian military on the Ukrainian soil. According to his social media profiles, he served in Russian Bataisk, in the Rostov region, and comes from Altai. That's the region in Russia. This is what we know about him.
The Ukrainian armed forces recently neutralized a sabotage reconnaissance group and captured 4 people. Among them was Viktor Ageyev, a resident of the Altai region of Russia. He served in the People's Militia of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic. However, according to his social media profiles, he served in the Russian city of Bataisk in the Rostov region. His mother suspected that her son had gone to fight in Ukraine. In his letters, he said, "Yes, I'm in Ukraine. They pay enough." The Russian Ministry of Defense denied Ageyev's affiliation with the Russian army. The Union of the Committees of Soldiers' Mothers of Russia called this statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense a dirty trick.
French President Emmanuel Macron has stepped in as an active leader in French-Germany tandem communication between Russia and Ukraine in the Normandy format, and is an open critic of the Russian policy towards Ukraine. This week he has met Ukrainian President Poroshenko, as there will be a new meeting at G20 summit this week between world leaders, including the US President Trump and Russian leader Putin. What is Macron's policy towards Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe? What can we expect? We've spoken to Marie Mendras, professor at Sciences Po University School of International Affairs in Paris, one of the key French experts on Russia and Eastern Europe. We are looking closely at the French foreign policy with newly elected President Macron. He shows his open and very critical position towards Russia. She's like a new force in uniting Europe. At the moment, in the context of French involvement into the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, what we can expect?
Yes, so France has gone through tremendous transformation politically, because we have a new president whom nobody knew about a year ago. He was Minister of the Economy during, 18 months, but people didn't really notice him. So he's very new, he's very smart, and he's very popular. 66% of the vote in the second round, even if there was high abstention, still it's amazing for somebody who had no popularity whatsoever a year ago. A new government, with the exception of maybe 3-4 members of government. All the other members of government were unknown to the public. And a new National Assembly where 75%, if I'm not mistaken, of the deputies never were deputies before. So it's an extraordinary overhaul of the political class and political representation in various institutions. Of course, it's difficult to predict what Emmanuel Macron is going to do. First, because he's never been dealing with foreign affairs and security problems before. It's really his very first time. He's learning fast, but he has a lot to learn still. Second, difficult to predict because France is not the only player. That is, I think what is quite new in what Emmanuel Macron wants to do, and I think he's very right, is not to try and build a new nationalist French policy in Europe or in relations with Russia or the United States. He claims he wants to build a European foreign policy supported by France. He is a Europeanist at heart. He is advised by individuals that know Europe, that some have been MEPs, and so he will go for a pro-European policy. He's going for a very strong Franco-German tandem with Mrs. Merkel, and this is really a new fact, because if you remember with François Hollande or his predecessor Nicolas Sarkozy, France was more on the line of French power projection, like operation in Mali, for example, under Hollande, or with Sarkozy, tried to be, the big, strong guy in Europe, but having a national French policy towards Russia, toward the United States, and this is gone. So we are experiencing something very new. I think it's very welcome in Europe. I think most European countries are very happy that France is going to go for a more collective European approach, and this is exactly what we need if we want to have the right policy toward Ukraine and also toward Russia. We need to continue collective action, and the Minsk process is one of the best examples of this.
So how it all would be, these intentions of Macron and this European view, his policy, would be translated into the action regarding how might be translated into some kind of the actions towards Ukraine, towards Russia. We're speaking about, financial support to Ukraine, big involvement into the Normandy meeting and Normandy Forum. There is a bit of the open, I would say it's still an open confrontation and kind of a clear more brave, openly, definitely more brave and open and sincere, stance on, on Putin, for instance, because before it was very...
I think the French position on Putin and the Kremlin leadership has been pretty clear for years. And since the annexation of Crimea and military conflict in the eastern Donbass, the French government has never taken this lightly, and the confrontation with Russia is now a fact. Every single Western democracy has now a very difficult, tense, and sometimes conflictual relationship with Moscow. So France is not alone in this situation. And so Emmanuel Macron has to think about it. How can he still maintain some kind of state-to-state relationship with the Russian leadership, and at the same time have a policy towards Ukraine, towards Georgia, Moldova, and other countries of the Eastern Partnership without caring too much about how Moscow may retaliate. So I think this is at the moment what Emmanuel Macron is thinking about, is how to dissociate the policies toward Moscow from our European policies toward Ukraine, but knowing very well that the two problems are impossible to dissociate.
And to what extent we can expect change and maybe big involvement, because France has been always seen in Europe as somebody who would take care about southern borders, about Mediterranean, and not so much about Eastern Europe, where Germany would take a lead.
The fact that we will reinforce the tandem with Germany is a good sign of this. It's not in the French habits to to pay much attention to the smaller countries of the EU when it comes to big security issues. Now, with what the Kremlin is doing, endangering our security, not only because of what it does in Ukraine, but also with cyber subversion, meddling in elections, and other problems, it seems to me that the French people and the French government understand that security issues, that covers everything. Now, the problem for Emmanuel Macron, as I see it, is that although he does understand the need to work together with the other EU partners and also other NATO member states, he also wants to safeguard France's specificity and have some kind of direct relationship with both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. It's difficult with both leaders for very different reasons, but I think this is what he wants to do, is have maybe not a working relationship, but at least some kind of a dialogue with Vladimir Putin, which is why he accepted to have him come to Versailles at the end of May to give him, to give him a try and see how it goes. And probably this is also why he invited Donald Trump to celebrate the 14th of July, Bastille Day, in France, to see how he can establish a one-to-one relationship and maybe reassure the American administration and the American public.
The lack of trust in institutions, governments and politicians is a global problem. Historically, in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, the population has even more reasons to be concerned. And we are now exactly building many state institutions from scratch or reforming old machines. How can Ukraine create trustworthy institutions? That was the topic of the discussion Hromadske recorded with Peter Wagner, head of the Ukraine support group to the European Commission, Khatia Dekanoidze, the head of Ukrainian National Police for 2015-2016, and Hlib Vyshlinskiy, executive director at Center for Economic Strategy. They debated on how to reform law enforcement agencies and courts, what should be done with state property, and how to restore confidence in the financial sector.
Today is the Center for Economic Strategy organized a discussion how to create trustworthy institutions in Ukraine. And now, after this debate, we are speaking to Peter Wagner, head of Ukraine support team at the European Commission, and Khatia Dekanoidze, who was the head of Ukrainian National Police for 2015 and 2016, about some issues that were not covered during the discussion, like that are the most important for the country right now, not only in the strategic perspective as what was discussed earlier. So my first question, and I will start from Khatia, is What are the key risks and challenges for Ukraine now? We see very low level of trust to all government institutions, to politicians, to opposition. What, in your opinion, is what government and civil society and general public should focus on now to prevent the further political, military or economic crisis?
Thank you very much for inviting, and thank you very much for being organizer of this wonderful discussion. I think it's great because we need to speak up about the problem which are very much important in the country. So key challenges, of course, they are the same. Corruption, and all country, I mean, our citizens, civil society, even government, you know, I mean, free media, we just have been talking about the corruption, to defeat corruption, but unfortunately still, you know, just so-called internal demons, which we call corruption, is still in charge of everything, right? And if there is corruption, and if just ordinary citizen and ordinary civil servant sees that there is still a kind of redistribution of the authority and the financial resources in the government and in the people who are in charge of the reforms, then just ordinary citizens, you know, they really don't trust the institutions which might be trusted, right? So corruption is a main challenge. Second is that not to risk of reversing the reforms which had been done, you know, after Maidan. And especially I'm very much frightened, and probably some of my colleagues and friends also, that after visa-free it can be done by somehow the how to say, the gambling situation, when we have visa-free right now and all reforms can be stopped, right? Or just doing nothing. And also I think the third main challenge, of course, which is very much important, is that to be under the threat of the external enemies, which is still strong and still occupying and trying to occupy occupying our territory. But actually, we had been always saying about the defeating inside enemies, but we have to realize and understand that we can defeat our external enemy if we will be able to defeat our internal enemies, right? So three main challenges, again, to sum it up. It's corruption, again, this state institutions that are not trusted by the people and government overall, and also not to risk and reverse backward the reforms after the visa-free regime, which is kind of huge destination for our country. When we can go inside in details, I mean, what kind of reforms is very much important for the country, but to run up the country is much important, right? I mean, to be very tough everywhere. But unfortunately, this government and the people who are in charge of changing country, they are not doing enough efforts.
Vacher.
I think Khatia listed the main elements, and I would therefore would like to add one additional dimension, and that is this kind, what I would call double duality. What do I mean? You have the fact that Ukraine, you referred to it, is fighting at the external front, and is at the same time fighting on the internal front with numerous reforms and fights against many people, enemies of progress achieved since Maidan. And that is, and the other dimension is that the external side is not seeing it as the Ukrainians do. The Ukrainians very much see the two conflicts, the internal and the external one, at a more or less equal level. From the outside, it is that people see mainly the internal conflicts with a very strong focus only on anti-corruption measures. Nobody looks at the enormous reform efforts and sometimes successes in areas such as procurement, the national bank, but of course forthcoming challenges like the pension and the health reform. And on the outside, everybody is ignoring the fact that Ukraine is a country that is suffering from external aggression. And I think this duality is a little bit a challenge because you're talking and perceived differently.
Yeah, and regarding the questions that was raised by Khatia on what to do after visa-free regime is granted by the European Union. Today there was a debate on whether this sandwich pressure between international partners and civil society should continue as the main trigger and driver of reforms, or should in fact Ukrainian politicians start doing their jobs and under the pressure of regular citizens do they work properly and conduct all needed reforms. Looking from experience of, for example, new member countries and the situation you see now in Ukraine, also you worked on Greece like another interesting case. Do you believe that there some tool is needed by the European Union and by the international other international partners that should serve as new external driver for Ukrainian reforms, or that those who defended today the idea that Ukrainians should be in charge are right?
Ukrainians are in charge of their reforms and have to be in charge of their reform. It's this famous ownership issue, and I'm deeply convinced there is a strong sense of ownership in the Ukrainian population. And there is a strong sense of ownership for reforms in the government and in politics, but not everywhere. And that momentum has to be kept up. Where I have my very strong doubts is these external elements. Ukraine will for a long time need and for sure receive support from its international partners as long as it is on the reform path. But generally speaking, I have very strong doubts that you can buy or force reforms from the outside. The IMF tranches, the macro-financial assistance of the EU, they are elements that help Ukraine to move on the reform path, but you will never get a reform only because it has been put into a memorandum of understanding. You have to have as a starting point something else. And that is where I think one should not forget and also not underestimate the moral dimension of what is going on in Ukraine, because it was not a revolution because of a shortage of cash flow. It was a revolution for certain values, for certain principles. And that is where I think the external side, the EU and others, definitely still have a role to play, because the people on Maidan and still nowadays see the EU as a benchmark, the way they want to live, the freedom they want to have. It's not a passport and the possibility to work abroad. It's the question of freedom and of belonging to a wider Western society that has been driving the people, and not just a bit of money or a passport as such.
In fact, Georgia was the only country in the region that achieved significant success in destroying the Soviet corrupt system without EU accession as the main trigger and driver of it. But it is the only case. Do you believe that Ukraine has a chance to do the same as Georgia did, or EU accession perspective is the only strategic perspective that should help Ukraine in the way to really get rid of Soviet system?
Well, each country has the preliminary requests and demands from EU before becoming the part of EU. And of course, if we admit that the huge success had been done in Georgia, it's true. It's true, and let me explain in a couple of words why this success was a true story and a true success story. First of all, because of the teamwork of the government, and because of the true political will that if we change everything. This is first. Second, Georgia was in the war too, just beginning from early 90s. I mean, the 25% of the territory of Georgia is still occupied by Russian Federation. And if you remember, in 2008, we had a huge, massive attack from Putin in Georgia. But despite the fact, Georgia just was the very good atmosphere for foreign investment and free of corruption, and the Georgian exchange rate, I mean the national lari, was very favorable. So it means that the political will was very broad, and the people in the government understood that to create the modern state country and a state as Georgia is very much important, right? Because when before the revolution of the Rose, when some foreign articles had been mentioning Georgia, they mentioned it like failed state, right? And after the revolution, I mean, we became the #1 country in the region which was free of corruption. And also the great success story was that the young generation did not know, and they still don't know, what is corruption and what is modern post-Soviet Georgia. So it's very much important. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, we don't have a generation which is not very much familiar with corruption and the situation which in the state's institutions. I think that we have a chance. Ukraine. I can admit that we missed a lot of opportunities and time after Maidan, because, as Peter mentioned, what was Maidan about? Maidan was about the dignity of the people, right? And dignity and the values which are very much important for Ukrainian people. Values that we must be free, we must be the part of Europe, we must be the people which will not be under Putin, under Russian Federation, and we must be the people which understand what is a free world and the real world in the situation. So, and if you say that the corruption in the country does not necessarily mean that the people are okay with the values, of course not, because of course it touches the dignity of the Ukrainian people also. So I think that the chances still exist, but look at the people. I mean, nobody is getting richer in this country. I mean, people are getting poorer, and that's a number one statistics that we have to admit, and the government must look at it. And also the one person at the conference panel discussion had mentioned the immigration problem. Yes, I mean, young people immigrated, and they still are continuing to leave the country because they are looking for the better efforts and opportunities, right? So we must be very, very attractive for our own generation, our own citizen, right? So I think that the chances, and these chances must be defended by the civil society, free media, which is unfortunately the shrinking in its size, and young generation, and not to give the opportunity to the oligarchs to be covered and to cover everything and to see the kind of frustration that nothing will be changed and it's our ideology, it's our mentality. No, because Ukrainian people did not know corruption for a while, right? And our mentality is like that we're free people. So I think that if we can fight in this direction.
Thank you. So Peter, the last question. On one side, like from the experience of new member states that came through the accession process. On another side, like looking from the current situation in Ukraine, like what tools could be used by the European Union to help in democratization of Ukraine and building these trustworthy institutions?
What is very important is what I think we have now done with the delivery on the visa liberalization and the DCFTA association agreement, that we also deliver on our promises and that we confirm that we are and prove that we are reliable partners. That's a very first important issue, the pacta sunt servanda. Secondly, I think there is still an enormous readiness to support Ukraine, and there is the impression that it is not necessarily an issue of money. Many of the things the EU makes available annually, around 200 million euro, just for the reform support. With that you can run a lot of reform support projects. The macroeconomic situation has improved. Now it is important that this money is used strategically, and that is where on the one hand the wider economic and legal situation has to allow that business can develop, because then the EU can come in with a whole set of, be they called in pre-enlargement, be they called whatever, but they are financial instruments, guaranteeing microcredits, loans, which can come in, for which the money would be available and which would help stimulate the economy. But none of these instruments makes a lot of sense in an environment of legal uncertainty where everybody has to fear corporate raiding. Thirdly, it's very important that the EU remains a kind of a benchmark on this value dimension, that the people also see the EU as a partner in the fight for certain principles, and that we stick to these principles, not only internally, but also in the way we defend vocally them outside the EU. And then I think there is a fourth one, and that is we can help by a policy of what I would call stability and a quiet hand. We have to accept, and that's more towards us than towards Ukraine, that the changes to come are not an issue of 2 or 3 years. And we have to get out of what I call the romantic approach. There was a revolution, and in 3 years the country will be different. Yes, there was a revolution, but now we are in the transition. And this is something that will take a very long time. And one has to just recall permanently that one is ready to go that way in a stable manner together.
Thanks for watching from the entire team at Hromadske International. Check the full versions of our reports and interviews on our webpage en.hromadske.ua. Search and follow Hromadske International on Facebook and Twitter. Stay tuned for our latest updates, and goodbye.